All right, we're recording. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for coming. To everyone, as we know, today we're having Mr. Reason Foundation's Mr. Jacob Rich, who will be speaking on marijuana legalization and its effects on commerce. This is a joint event with Eagles for Liberty from Florida Gulf Coast University and Vanderbilt Libertarians. Mr. Jacob James Rich is a policy analyst at Reason. His work focuses primarily on healthcare policy, specializing in prescription and illegal drug regulation. Prior to joining Reason, he conducted research for the Cato Institute focused on economics and opioid policy, and he holds master's degrees in mathematics and economics from Eastern Michigan University. Mr. Rich, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Donald. And thank you to all the SFL Student for Liberty chapters that have decided to have me. It's a pleasure to talk about the subject with all of you. So to begin, let's kind of discuss my background a little bit. I'm a mathematician, but one thing that I've noticed since coming to Washington is that laws and their interpretation and their enforcement is incredibly arbitrary. And nothing to take away from law degrees. They're very important. Credential to have in order to understand how law works and to write legislation effectively so that it can sustain itself and so it can be good in the long run. But one thing I've really noticed is that other fields often have a lot of insight to bring to law, since law is kind of taught within a closed box. And there's not a lot of perceptions and perspectives that can really go outside the norm. So ever since coming to Reason Foundation, I've had a unique opportunity to look at this as a mathematician, as an economist. And yeah, I just kind of want to share with you guys basically what I've seen and what I've been able to do in terms of advising lobbyists, lawmakers, politicians, and all sorts of people in DC. So I think the best way to talk about marijuana is to first discuss its history. Oftentimes when I go to the Heritage Foundation, they're all about this idea of conserving liberty. Very constitutionally minded, this idea that the Constitution provided a whole bunch of liberties. And in order for us to contain this idea of freedom that is unique to the West, we need to preserve the Constitution. It goes back to Locke, how the Lockean influenced the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, and whatnot. But one thing that really strikes me as odd with these conservative organizations, whether it be the Heritage Foundation or the American Enterprise Institute or the Hoover Foundation, or no, the Hoover Institution up in Stanford, they all seem to be incredibly about freedom until it's about what you put into your body. And one of the most original, quote, what I would call conservative ideas is the idea of to put whatever you want into your body without any sort of consequence from the law. And the reason I say this is because drug legalization or drug illegalization, banning and prohibiting substances, is barely 100 years old in the United States. It really wasn't until the early 1900s that any sort of regulation was being put on narcotics. Now, I think there's one exception to that rule. I think the city of Sacramento in California did put a ban on opium dens when they had massive immigration influxes from China. But other than that, in the movement, which was very racialized against Chinese immigrants in the form of opium den bans, there really wasn't much going on. It really wasn't until the passage of the, what's the real name of it? The Pure Food and Drug Act, which is actually the precursor to the Food and Drug Administration in 1906, that we see any sort of real regulation coming from the states or the federal government. The reason for this is because the federal government basically gave states the jurisdiction to start enforcing against, how would you say, adulterants and poisons that might be put into products, food products. Now, originally, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed because people were selling all sorts of food and substances and elixirs that the contents weren't quite known. And if you were someone who was unfortunate to have a peanut allergy, you might take something that has peanuts without it being listed and have some sort of allergic reaction. Or sometimes there would be adulterants in there, and the FDA wanted the ability to test for what was in these substances to make sure it matched what was listed on the label. So that was the original purpose of this. But it ended up being weaponized by the states because the idea of a poison wasn't explicitly defined by the federal government. So the states actually, within their own powers, had the ability to define poisons. And at 1906, immediately after this bill was passed, Washington, D.C., which we all know is not the best for liberty, even though I'm here and it's actually not too bad, but we can get to that in a minute. But they actually immediately after the passage in 1906 listed marijuana as a poison that they would be regulating coming in and out of DC. Now, it's not like a technical prohibition, but the very interesting way of labeling something as a poison in order to prohibit is a mechanism that has been used throughout the federal government's history. And throughout tonight, you'll see how the federal government and state governments, and basically governments at all levels, have used very clever ways to not quite prohibit substances explicitly, but the implications is basically pure prohibition. So since then, there were a couple laws that were passed, but I'm just going to touch on the brief history of marijuana before we get into that. From the best of my knowledge, the first state to ban marijuana was Maine. There's a lot of other laws that were passed before that that had very prohibitive consequences, but I mean, if you look at it, I think Maine's was the most encompassing and the first one that we could probably define as a first prohibition. Then after marijuana was kind of gone after a little bit, the next thing that really happened in the grand scheme of things is actually kind of based on what I was telling you earlier with the opium dens. It was actually the Harrison Narcotics Act, which was passed in, I think, 1914. Yeah, 1914. And the Harrison Narcotics Act, this was very interesting because Woodrow Wilson just became president. I'm pretty sure it was William Howard Taft running against Teddy Roosevelt. They split the Republican votes, and then Woodrow Wilson, person who should have never became president, and in my opinion, probably the most anti-liberty president in the history of the country. And that's because it's not really Richard Nixon that started the war on drugs, but it was pretty much Woodrow Wilson who started the war. He started it with the Harrison Narcotics Act, which made opium and cocaine for the consumption of recreational purposes illegal, explicitly illegal. So that doesn't really have much implication on marijuana directly, but it is the first go about way that the federal government ended up banning a substance. And this law would eventually be reviewed in 1971 as a justification for the government to completely ban marijuana altogether. But from about 1906, from the passage of the Pure Foods and Drug Act until 1937, Tax Act, Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, it was all state level regulation that was affecting marijuana. And I think almost a majority of states by 1937 had explicitly made marijuana illegal. But another interesting thing is that it was actually Franklin Delano Roosevelt who explicitly put a federal law in place. The first president to affect this at the national level was FDR. Many people know FDR as a quote unquote liberal, but many of the policies he put in place may be progressive, maybe finding ways to take people's money and redistribute it. Maybe if you consider that liberal, which I don't, maybe you could call that liberal, but lots of other things he did were incredibly illiberal. The Marijuana Tax Act was one of them. And then he actually made the possession of large amounts of gold illegal. And he was actually setting the price of gold. And there's a very interesting story about that if you guys would like to look into it. But basically, there was some pretty large interest from manufacturers of paper and nylon and other substances that were competing with hemp to make hemp illegal because it was basically better and cheaper to produce. The DuPont family was one of the major producers of nylon at the time, and they actually lobbied for the Marijuana Tax Act to make it harder to acquire hemp. And basically what it did is it put a tax on hemp such that it was no longer economically suitable to be producing it as a competitor to nylon and paper and other products. At the same time, we had Harry Anslinger. Now, Harry Anslinger was the director of what is now known as the Drug Enforcement Administration, but I think it was like the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. That was what he was in charge of. At the time, or really just before that, he was enforcing alcohol laws. But because of the 21st Amendment, which made the alcohol prohibition illegal, that bureau basically had nothing to do. So it was actually a joint effort with Harry Anslinger and the DuPont family and other nylon investors to pass this Marijuana Tax Act, which ended up making marijuana illegal, effectively making marijuana illegal by basically putting a tax in place that wasn't able to be followed in any sort of way. So then we go on for about 22 years, or actually 32 years, with no major things happening in marijuana. Actually, I might have done my math wrong. 32. Yeah, 32 years. And then 1969 comes along, the Summer of Love. And there was this Harvard professor by the name of Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was, I'm pretty sure, a psychologist. And he was big into MDMA, but people who use some drugs sometimes use others. He also liked marijuana. And in 1965, he was caught with marijuana, a small amount of marijuana. And then he challenged it because the original law at the time was the Marijuana Tax Act. But there's something very interesting about the Marijuana Tax Act. The Marijuana Tax Act not only puts a tax on marijuana, but it explicitly stated who was not supposed to be consuming marijuana as well. But the taxes, as written in the law, were often applied to the illegal users. So Timothy Leary, obviously being a smart guy, Harvard University president, he challenged the law under Fifth Amendment grounds, saying that if someone breaks the law, in order to fulfill the Marijuana Tax Act, they need to turn themselves in, which is completely unconstitutional. Completely unconstitutional to expect people to turn themselves in for a crime. So because of the clumsy writing of the law, in 1969, when it finally made it to the Supreme Court was like, yeah, you're right, Leary. And they struck down the Marijuana Tax Act, and marijuana was then legal for about a year, which is pretty cool. I think that's pretty cool. But then Richard Nixon wasn't having any of it, and he worked with Congress to then pass the Controlled Substances Act. Controlled Substances Act then basically made marijuana a Schedule I narcotic. That's the most restricted narcotic. That means that there's absolutely no medical benefits from it, according to the government. And that is completely illegal for any sort of purpose. So due to that, we've had a very long, arduous relationship with marijuana policy in this country. What actually ended up happening immediately after the Controlled Substances Act was passed was that Timothy Leary then ran for governor of California, where he was a resident. And at the time, Ronald Reagan was a governor. And then Ronald Reagan actually used the new Controlled Substances Act with federal officials to follow Timothy Leary, and they found him with 2 marijuana joints in his car, smoked actually. There wasn't even really any marijuana left, and they threw him in prison for 10 years. And then there's an amazing book called The Most Dangerous Man in America, which I encourage you all to read because the Black Panthers ended up breaking him out of prison. And the true story behind this is crazier than any fiction I've ever read. But basically, after the Controlled Substances Act was passed, there was just an arduous, incredible criminalization of marijuana that has persisted until about 2012 when Oregon and Colorado legalized marijuana. Now, there was a couple things that happened before that. In, I think, 1973, Oregon became the first state to decriminalize marijuana. And then in 1996, California became the first state to quote unquote legalize medical marijuana. We'll talk about what legalization in the context of Schedule I means in a moment. But it really wasn't until 2012 that marijuana was available for widespread purchase. So with all these questions in mind, I was asked to talk about the implications on interstate commerce with the legalization of marijuana. This is very interesting because every single substance that is considered dangerous in the United States is regulated completely different. And that's because of the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Basically, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution grants absolute, complete authority on regulating interstate commerce to Congress, the federal government. But there is a way that states can regulate interstate commerce, given that. It's that Congress passes an explicit law granting states the authority to enforce the laws, the interstate commerce laws that they put forward. So in order to talk about this a little bit, I think we should reference other quote unquote dangerous products that you can buy. And probably the first one that comes to mind is quote alcohol. Alcohol was made illegal with the 18th Amendment. That happened immediately after Woodrow Wilson's prohibitions on cocaine and heroin. He actually basically made alcohol illegal in the United States before the 18th Amendment. There's this misconception that it was an absolute drop-off that led to the 18th Amendment. But during World War I, he used some War Powers Acts to basically make all alcohol in the United States illegal, except for the production of near beer, which is like 1% alcohol at most. So for all intents and purposes, Woodrow Wilson made alcohol illegal before the 18th Amendment. And it was very easy to slide into the 18th Amendment after the war was over. But the 21st Amendment basically sought to completely get rid of any sort of alcohol prohibition and actually put some very liberal things in place, basically giving states their own autonomy to regulate alcohol as ever they see fit. So because of this, lots of interesting things have happened through the cronyism of businesses trying to lobby for protection from other states. One thing that happened as recently as I think it was 2006, actually, Michigan and New York, they passed laws saying that their wine companies could deliver wine to their own residents, but wine companies from outside of the state were not allowed to. And because these types of provisions were never granted to the states, these provisions to regulate interstate commerce were never given to the states, the Supreme Court ended up striking it down and saying that it was not constitutional to do so. In stark contrast with that is gun laws. And this actually follows the Gun Regulation Act passed under not Woodrow Wilson, his brother in crime, what I like to call, Lyndon B. Johnson in the 60s. He passed probably the most stringent gun laws. And these gun laws give states massive authority to regulate the ownership and transportation of guns. So with alcohol, there's actually been cases where people have bought alcohol that they're not allowed to buy in their state, and their state originally said was not even allowed to be possessed. I forget which state it was, but there was a state that basically said Everclear level of alcohol, which is like literally 95% liquor, that was not even allowed to be possessed, let alone bought in the state. But then someone bought it in another state, brought it into their state, and the courts ruled, yeah, you guys have no jurisdiction over interstate commerce. You can prevent it from being sold here, but you cannot prevent someone from bringing it over state lines. And that's because of what was written for alcohol specifically, but the gun laws are very different. What was passed under Lyndon B. Johnson granted states wide authority to basically ban the ownership and possession of certain types of guns. Now, guns are very interesting because it runs into the Second Amendment protection. So there's this idea that they could regulate in some ways, but anything that prevents someone from protecting themselves or using guns that would allow for a militia or self-defense was then defended again. So that's why the courts are still discussing gun laws and why there's all sorts of banter around guns at the moment. But one interesting thing, even with states having the ability to ban the possession of guns, there are certain circumstances where they aren't allowed to ban the possession. So think of Virginia. The gun laws of Virginia with the new Democrat governor, well, he's not that new, relatively new. But he's been putting gun laws in place, or at least trying to, but none have really passed yet. So the gun laws here are actually pretty liberal. Say you have a gun in West Virginia, or say you have a gun in West Virginia and you want to transport it to Virginia, and you end up going through Washington, D.C. Well, if a cop pulls you over in Washington, D.C., and you have the gun, yet you were explicitly transporting it from West Virginia to Virginia, there's nothing the cop can do because you are transporting the goods. You're not stopping there. So that type of possession is actually allowed under interstate commerce. And how this relates to marijuana really just depends on the type of legalization that is passed. There are three different types of legalization we should talk about. First is local level, municipality, state level legalization. The second is legalization done directly through the executive branch. And then the final type is legalization passed by Congress. The first one, which we have seen in Colorado, Oregon, even Michigan, California, and 11 other states, the recreational, quote, legalization of marijuana. One thing that everyone needs to keep in mind is that federal laws always supersede state laws. So just because a state says something is legal, that doesn't mean it's really legal. That basically means it's decriminalized for that government's level of enforcement. So if Colorado quote unquote legalizes marijuana, legalizes the sales of whatnot, for all intents and purposes, it's still illegal, but they basically have told their own officers to stop enforcing the federal laws, and all officers below, so state level below, to the local municipalities, the towns and cities. And with those, you basically have people operating businesses. They effectively operate businesses. But something to keep in mind is that if federal officials ever came into the state and wanted to prosecute even the possession of marijuana, they would be well within their right to. So everyone on this call, keep in mind that if you are consuming marijuana in the United States, you can be punished at any time. And I always urge people never, ever, ever get a medical marijuana card, because once you get a medical marijuana card, you're in a government system that you consume marijuana. And ATF, the Bureau for Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, they have explicitly said anyone who is on a list for medical marijuana is not allowed to own or possess a gun. So you're going to be put on a list to basically never buy guns until marijuana is legalized. And you really don't want to run into that type of trouble. For all intents and purposes, marijuana is so easy to get without a card. I don't really think it's worth getting a card. But the implications for interstate commerce under state level legalization are quite simple. It's illegal. The federal government has said that marijuana is illegal, and everything that goes over state borders is, for all intents and purposes, actually over federal government property. So like when you're going over the border, at that moment, you are actually under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So all of their laws apply. There's absolutely no transportation of marijuana that's allowed. I mean, now the implications on underground interstate commerce probably aren't that restrictive, because so far we don't have any border stops. And hopefully we never will have any state level border stops, because having such a large country that we can easily move around within is one of the beauties of this country. But it's safe to say that when states have legal marijuana operations, like Oregon and Washington, and they're right next to each other, and the demand for marijuana does not meet the supply, like happened in Oregon a few years ago, you probably have trucks of marijuana going over the Oregon border and just pretending as if they were grown in Washington. Now, there are some tracking services that the states have enforced and regulated in order to try to prevent this, trying to trace where the original seed was all the way to the final sale, which is a little draconian, but there are ways around it. So because we don't have any border stops, I assume there is a lot of transportation within the gray legal market. I don't want to say legal, but the regulated market. Basically marijuana grown in one state and then sold in recreational stores in another state. The implications of laws that are being considered right now don't really change this much. The Safe Banking Act, that only affects banking, not really much to do there. The MORE Act, I forget whether it actually changes the schedule. If it changes the schedule, then all bets are off. But if it doesn't, then it definitely doesn't affect the interstate commerce implications of marijuana prohibition at state level legalization. One act that was really interesting, though, that I got into some arguments with some high-powered lawyers in DC was the States Act, because what the States Act says is that if a state says it's legal, then the federal government has to recognize it as legal. So if two states then write that they're willing to trade marijuana with each other, does the federal government then have to respect that? It's not quite clear, because even if the two states say that and the federal government says, yeah, they're allowed to transport, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, still has jurisdiction over the marijuana the second it's crossing over the borders. And that means that there's not really a clear-cut way. I mean, one thing with law, like I was discussing earlier, is that's completely arbitrary sometimes. So it really just depends what jury's in front of you, what judge is in front of you in this case. It really could go either way. But the States Act is probably the only law that I've seen that could coexist with state-level legalization that would allow interstate commerce to legally happen. Honestly, because the federal government tends to always side with itself, it would be DEA versus marijuana businesses. I assume DEA would win. That's basically what I see every single time DEA goes to court. But it is interesting to think that there is a gray area there. But honestly, with Democrats controlling Congress, I do expect marijuana to be legalized at the federal level. So let's discuss that real quick, the two ways that that could happen. The first way is through executive action. Now, how do I put this? It's really interesting because everyone says we need to pass a bill. We actually don't need to pass a bill. The Controlled Substances Act passed in 1970, and I think signed in 1971. It explicitly gives the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice complete authority over scheduling all narcotics. So it's not like the Secretary of HHS can just say marijuana is legal and it happens, but there is a specific way in order to do so. Basically, either the Attorney General or the Secretary of Health and Human Services announces that they want to do a reschedule. And then this order, depending on who is said by, whether HHS or DOJ, is then sent to the other organization. And then they do a report. They basically send some information back. They let the United Nations know that we intend to reschedule a drug. And then after some more bureaucratic processes, the drug is rescheduled. So we don't even need Congress to legalize marijuana. If the Biden administration wanted to take the initiative and completely remove marijuana from the scheduling, it most certainly could. And the interstate commerce implications of that are very interesting. I'm not a law expert. I'm a mathematician, but in my knowledge, basically dealing with this, if the federal government was to make such a move, I would expect that the states would have absolutely no jurisdiction over interstate commerce because, again, interstate commerce powers are absolute for the federal government. The only way the states can actually regulate is when the federal government gives them explicit powers. And if the drug's legal across the United States, according to the federal government, states could definitely pass their own laws saying you can't sell it here. But they definitely could not pass laws saying that you couldn't buy it in another state and then bring it in. And because of that, I think that the best way to legalize marijuana in the United States would be to completely ignore Congress, use the powers of the executive branch, and just deschedule it within. Now, Biden's kind of a drug warrior. He's probably, out of all of our presidents since Richard Nixon, he's probably been the most anti-drug in how he's voted. He's voted for incredibly draconian drug policies since 1972, I think. I think that's when he first got in office. He actually voted in 1973 to put extra regulations on medications designed to help drug addicts, which has prevented many people from getting drug services in the United States, has really disproportionately led to a bunch of overdoses in the country, to be completely frank. But that's a whole nother issue. The other way that marijuana could be legalized, the third and final way it could be legalized, is finally through Congress. And if it is done in that sort of way, well, it's basically up to Congress how the interstate commerce is going to be applied. It could be a very liberal interpretation, like it did with the 21st Amendment, where basically states have almost no jurisdiction to be regulating what types of alcohols are going over their borders and whatnot, and what people can purchase in one state and bring it back. But they could also regulate it like firearms, where they could give the states the jurisdiction to say what is even allowed to be possessed in the state, even if it's purchased outside of the state. It's going to be completely arbitrarily chosen, and I really don't have a good way of predicting how it's going to go. The only thing I can tell you is that businesses within the United States will lobby for their own interests, and whatever those interests at the time will probably prevail in the regulation of marijuana in terms of interstate commerce. So I don't think I have too much more to add to this. So thank you so much for having me. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me right now. It was a pleasure talking.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rich, for your talk. We will open things up for Q&A now. So if anybody has a question, I see Ned, you have a question? Or no, that's applause. Just kidding. Yeah, so if anyone has a question, feel free to just, go for it. Do you guys have a question? Do you want to come up here? Sure. We have a question for you here. Say hello to Daniel.
Hi, Dan.
Hello. Well, Mr. Rich, thank you very much for the talk. It was very informative. My question for you, one of the aspects of drug legalization that makes it very appealing to me is how it would ideally cancel out the black market. And of course, there is a black market because it's illegal. And the thing about a black market is that there's no standardized production and distribution. The people making it don't bother putting labels on ingredients. Basically, the drugs are however potent or deadly as the basement brewer wants them to be. So that's very, I consider very, dangerous and counterintuitive to the health of the populace. But the issue with legalization, and to my understanding, California is even with legalization, like in California specifically, the situation is that they're having a few issues. One is, the fact that, to my understanding, even though it's legalized on a state level, I believe, everyone doesn't want the store on their street, no one wants to, go out their house and see a bunch of druggies lining up joints down the road. But even more so than that, in California, to my understanding, there was a lot of regulation on, on commercial drug use. So much so that that drugs on the black market are still far more affordable. So my question then would be, what level of regulation, if any at all, do you think is necessary in an ideal scenario where drugs are legalized? And at what point, what's the balance between regulation, but not so much so to where the black market is still a far more affordable alternative to would-be users?
So I'm not an anarchist. I do believe in government. And I think that the original goal of the Pure Food and Drugs Act, which was passed in 1906, which preceded the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the idea of forcing companies to put what is in their products on the label and holding them accountable for not doing so, I never saw that as that big of an issue. Would it be in a perfect libertarian world, would market forces force companies to do that regardless? And could these regulations be weaponized in a weird way? Well, we saw the states weaponizing it against marijuana originally. So yeah, that could happen. And maybe an anarchic approach to this would be most efficient. But I think to answer your question, you're trying to discuss the best way to beat back the black market. The truth of the matter is the most expensive part of purchasing a product is the tax, right? And the only way that the black market can exist is if the tax is sufficiently high above production cost that a black market sees it as a good opportunity to come in and try to undersell the legal market. Alcohol is actually a great example of this. We don't see much black market production of alcohol. We don't even see much local production of alcohol. Well, once they got rid of a lot of the beer laws, we saw some craft brewing coming along, which has been an amazing development in this country. I know I've benefited from that. But, even though the alcohol laws the alcohol taxes are relatively high, they're not to the point to where a black market is undercutting them. But in California has by far the highest taxes. The taxes in California are absolutely ridiculous. And another thing, probably other than taxes, the only other thing that adds to the cost of an item is the distance that you need to travel in order to purchase it. Distance is time, it takes resources, it takes money to travel. And you can actually interpret that as a cost. And because of the not in my backyard laws, the NIMBY laws that have been passed in California, with some jurisdictions just not allowing cannabis producers and sellers to exist, it's it can take hours to travel across California to buy regulated cannabis. And with a black market that was already established in California before the law was passed, there's really been no incentive to move away from the illegal producers. I mean, that's really the point. I mean, you need to lower the regulations, no matter what the regulations are. This is the best way to think about it. Regulations need to be low enough such that the incentive to purchase the product from a black market instead of the regulated market above the production price does not exist. In California, there's far more marijuana that's purchased in the black market than in the legal market. Recently, I had a research, not like a research paper, but a research post published, retweeted by Rand Paul, basically talking about the federal implications of marijuana policy. So yes, if marijuana businesses were allowed to exist within the United States at the just recreationally, legally throughout the United States, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that there'd be $3 million in revenue brought into the federal government. That's like $0 at the federal government, but the fact that it was a bill that didn't cost money was kind of interesting. But the Congressional Budget Office mentioned that it did not even consider the federal taxation of marijuana. So after doing that and extrapolating over how much black market marijuana existing, I saw that that would actually be around $100 million that the federal government would be bringing in from legalized marijuana. And one thing to think about with marijuana is who is the biggest benefiter of money in terms of taxes. It's similar to alcohol. States make out like bandits in alcohol taxes compared to the federal government. And the same thing would happen with marijuana. So although the federal government is maybe foregoing $100 million because of the black market with marijuana, Sacramento as a city alone, is foregoing $9 million. Think of how many cities are Sacramento size across the United States. $9 million from Sacramento, that's absolutely ridiculous. That's billions upon billions of dollars for the thousands of counties that exist in the United States. So it's really interesting what the states are foregoing in terms of tax revenue for marijuana to be illegal. But yeah, long story short, the only way to get rid of the black market is for the regulations not to increase the total price above the production price so that people want to use the black market products. Did I answer your question?
So do you have any idea of how far, like to stay with California, how far they would have to cut their regulations and taxes before the legal use of marijuana is like more commercially attractive than the black market use?
Honestly, they would probably need to cut their taxes by 50 to 70%. And not only that, but they would have to force force local municipalities to start allowing marijuana companies to sell. The latter one's probably actually more important. I haven't quantified this in terms of a cost. I know it's a cost, like driving to out of the county across multiple counties to pick up marijuana, that costs gas, that costs mileage on your car, that costs your own time. But I've not quantified exactly the effects of that. So I can't give you any sort of percentage of marijuana distribution that the black market would cede once California decided to force counties to allow marijuana distributors to be in their counties. But that's actually probably more of a cost to people than the tax itself. I mean, they have the highest taxes in the country on marijuana. It's absolutely ridiculous. There's a couple things to consider with this. When the vaping epidemic happened, the E-Valley incidents, this was all from black market vaping cartridges. And me and Jeffrey Myron, he's a professor at Harvard, we actually published a paper with Reason showing that states that legalized marijuana coincidentally had the lowest rates of vaping-related illnesses. And it's no coincidence that the states that were regulating their marijuana products actually had the safest marijuana products to consume. And Massachusetts actually had the highest within the states that had legalized marijuana, but the entire state at the time only had 22 dispensaries, when at the same time, Colorado had about 180 dispensaries just in Denver alone, if that makes any sense. So I wish I could like cite an analysis on how much, like what specific regulations they would need to do. But I mean, the California tax is like more than double many of the other taxes. So I mean, bringing their taxes down to a reasonable level is probably the first thing that they should do. And you probably just noticed something in my language where I said California should force local municipalities to allow marijuana businesses. Well, I've actually always thought that this is the role of the federal government. The federal government shouldn't be putting like Medicare in place, putting these policies in place that, or these programs in place. I think the federal government's job is basically to tell what the states aren't allowed to do, to tell local governments what they're not allowed to do. That's basically what the First Amendment is. It basically says you cannot pass a law against free speech, against religion. You cannot pass it against assembly. And I think that's probably the best. That's probably the best focus of state level laws, is to tell these local governments that they can't prevent people from selling within their jurisdiction. Basically telling local governments that they can't infringe on the freedom of their ability to sell. So I think, yes, I think focusing on where and how many marijuana businesses there are in California is the first concern, and then getting taxes down to a reasonable level second. But those are the two major concerns. It's not, I don't think there's much of a concern on the production side, if that makes any sort of sense.
That makes sense. All right. Thank you very much. Oh, this is your phone.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, thank you, Daniel. And do we have any other questions? We don't have any questions in this room. If anyone else has any questions, this will be, I suppose, the final call.
I'd be interested. So you mentioned a paper about the vaping thing. Could you just mention the title or something so that we could, is there a way for us to find it, or is it like not published?
It's on reason.com. And the Journal of the American Medical Association actually published a paper completely copying our results too. So now we have one of the most historically anti-marijuana organizations publishing what we found. So I can send you guys a link to both if you want to distribute. The title, it's not too hard to find on reason.com. If you just like Google Jacob Rich, Jeffrey Myron, M-I-R-O-N, and I think the title is like legalizing marijuana is the best way to reduce vaping related illnesses. I think that's the title of the piece.
Great.
But I could definitely give you guys a link to distribute if you want, or I could maybe put it in the chat right now if you guys want to wait a second. While I'm typing this, are there any other questions?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. First of all, I want to thank you again for your time and being so cooperative in getting this organized on such short notice.
No problem.
But frankly, given the hypothetical scenario of widespread federal legalization, do you foresee any major legal challenges on the part of states that still want to be more restrictive?
It depends, because when states put legal challenges in place, they're usually strategic. So it really just completely depends how marijuana is legalized, right? It really just all comes down to what powers Congress delegates to the states in terms of interstate commerce. Now, if they do it at the executive level, as I discussed, that will probably bring about a lot of legal challenges. And although it's my opinion that if there's no explicit power given to the state to regulate, that they can't regulate, there might be some sympathetic judges that think that type of society isn't workable, and they might allow states to do so. And then it'll make its way through the circuit courts, and then it will make its way into the Supreme Court. And then I'm not exactly sure how the Supreme Court would actually judge on that. You got, quote unquote, a conservative judgeship at the moment, a conservative majority. But I mean, Gorsuch is kind of a liberal, to be honest. And I mean that in a very good way. I mean that in like in a libertarian way. So I don't even know where he would vote on it. Are there any specific things that you think they would challenge? Because I mean, okay, so it's probably good to like mention like what the states will probably be able to do. The federal government, no matter how it legalizes marijuana, will probably give jurisdiction to sell marijuana to the states. So, I mean, I don't even know how the states would even challenge that type of power that they're given. They just pass laws on like how much marijuana costs, where marijuana can be sold, how much it can be sold for, and even if it can be sold in the first place. I think that the states would might start challenging their authority to enforce whether someone buys marijuana out of state and brings it back in. And again, that just really comes down to what types of powers the federal government gives the states. It could be a case like firearms where they give them broad powers and they are actually able to make marijuana illegal even in terms of possession. Like you can't have an assault rifle in DC. Well, DC is actually very different because it's not a state, it's completely under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So that's not a good example. But I'm pretty sure you can't possess an assault rifle in California. And if you buy it legally in Montana and bring it over, you are under the jurisdiction of their laws. The federal government has allowed them to do that. So, I mean, if they do challenge, maybe it'll be because they want to have more power than the federal government gave them. And I think the 10th Amendment makes it explicitly clear that it's completely up to the federal government. But then again, a lot of things in the law are arbitrary. We would just have to see.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. So if we don't have any more questions, we'll make last call for any questions. And if not, Mr. Rich, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. If anyone's interested in keeping up to date on our FSU College Libertarian events, you can find us on Facebook at FSU College Libertarians. Brandon, Rourke, do you guys want to plug your social medias as well?
I'll defer to Rourke first.
Instagram and Facebook as Vanderbilt Libertarians.
And at FGCU, we are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Eagles for Liberty at FGCU. You can find us at Eagles for Liberty. That's the number 4. So stay in touch with us there.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coordinating this event for the 3 of our groups. And thank you again, Mr. Rich. We really appreciate it.
Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure. Yes, I'm the boss, so I get that. Bye, guys.